Allison, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Pedro. I want to thank you and the folks at AmCham, as well as Enrique at the U.S. Mexico Foundation for engaging me in this work. For many years, Enrique and I have been curious about what does the U.S. voter think about Mexico and the bilateral relationship. And this is something where there has traditionally been some level of public polling where people are asked, do you think a country is an ally or an adversary? Do you have a favorable or unfavorable view of that country? But very rarely do I see good public data that digs underneath the surface to figure out the why. What are people thinking about countries that are American allies? What's driving any favorability? And what are some of the factors that could be driving their hesitancy or reluctance to feel favorably toward that close ally? So what we've done here, I think, is very exciting because we've done a survey of American voters. We took a look at 1,000 voters in what we call the likely electorate, meaning we're looking at people who we believe are likely to participate in the next coming election, but we also factor in that there are some unlikely voters who participate too, and so we do some modeling to get to our audience of who those voters are that we're speaking to. It's a nationwide survey, and we conducted our most recent round in September. But I will say the thing that makes me the most excited about some of this data is we didn't just survey in September. We also had an opportunity to go into the field in June, and we went into the field in March. So we did 3 different touch points with voters to see where they were at on the question of the U.S.-Mexico relationship. And we could see what changed and what didn't over the course of these first many months of the second Trump administration. So with that in mind, I'll dig into the data. First, the perceptions of Mexico overall. So we wanted to get a little bit of a compare-contrast. How do American voters view Mexico, and where does that stand relative to other allies? Views of Mexico tend to be quite positive. By a net 14 points, Americans view Mexico more favorably than unfavorably. Some of those views are fairly soft, and for reasons that I'll discuss momentarily, it's because voters believe there are plenty of good things about our relationship with Mexico, but also have some concerns. And that's why you see so many of those voters falling into that sort of soft attitude bucket of either somewhat favorable, unsure, they don't really have a strong opinion, or feeling somewhat unfavorable. When we look at how this has trended over time, we've been asking this every month since March, and you can see things sort of ticking up and down here and there on these questions. You'll notice there's a fairly sizable spike in unfavorability in June, especially among Republicans, but it's not just Republicans. You'll also see that uptick in among Democrats. And what I would underscore for everybody is that in June, we were going into the field right in the heart of a significant number of immigration protests happening in Los Angeles. And you may recall in those protests, there were images that were all over American media of people going to these protests that in some cases turned a bit unruly, potentially violent, and people had Mexican flags at those protests. So I would just look at what happened in June with that spike in unfavorability as likely to be pretty directly related to that moment in time. But I think it is positive for the U.S.-Mexico relationship that those numbers sort of immediately revert back to normal just weeks after that was out of the news cycle. So what you were seeing in June was this temporary spike of a sort of unfavorable media moment that faded very quickly as people remembered what it is that they did favor and like about the U.S.-Mexico relationship. But notably, what I just showed you was Republicans, Democrats, and independents. And I think that the American electorate is much more complicated than that. In our June survey, we were fortunate not just to ask about a number of things regarding the U.S.-Mexico relationship, but we also asked a number of questions about people's overall political attitudes, whether they're socially conservative, whether they're economically conservative, as well as their views about foreign policy overall and their attitudes towards sort of establishmentarian entities. So how do they feel about the media? How do they feel about corruption? Things that don't fit neatly into a left-right spectrum. And what we found in our research is that there are really 8 different tribes of American voter, not just right and not just left. We found there are about 4 tribes that gravitate more toward the right, but only 17 17% of voters think of themselves on the hard right. Now, unfortunately for that group, they are quite unfavorable toward Mexico. They lean negative by a 42-point margin. We have other groups as well, the more moderate right, where they also sort of take more right-leaning positions on most issues, but they are supporters of free trade. And I think it's important to underscore that, because for this sort of a group, their opposition or their anxieties about Mexico are more framed around things like crime and migration than they are around things like trade or economic activity. The new Republican populists, which we find represents about 8% of voters, these are the folks that Donald Trump has really brought to the Republican Party, who probably voted for Bill Clinton back in the 90s. These are folks who are not necessarily all the way conservative on economic issues. They're very skeptical of free trade, but they're culturally quite conservative, and they're very anti-establishment. They don't trust politicians. They don't trust the media. And they're another group that sort of gravitates to the right, that leans more negative toward Mexico. But you also have a group called Middle American Optimists. And I think this is a fascinating group because they voted for Donald Trump by a 28-point margin, but they're also quite favorable to Mexico by an 8-point margin. So they differ from other groups on the right pretty notably. They're pretty optimistic about the ability to, say, get ahead through hard work. They tend to also think trade and exchange are positive. And I think this is a useful group to keep an eye on. Then you have groups like the young and disillusioned. They tend to be younger, more female, very racially diverse. They are quite economically progressive, but also quite anti-establishment. So they only voted for Kamala Harris by a 27-point margin, despite having attitudes that are pretty progressive. They just are no fans of the Democratic establishment. And there they lean favorable toward Mexico, but are not the most favorable toward Mexico. American institutionalists are a group that is leaning more Democratic these days, but perhaps in the past would have been the type of person to vote for a Mitt Romney. They have a lot of faith in hard work. They also believe in the police, in the rule of law, the U.S. economic model, but generally vote away from Republicans. You have a group called electability Democrats, which I would say are folks that they vote reliably Democratic, but they oppose their party's position on issues ranging from immigration to things like the police, certain issues in the LGBT issue set. And for them, they are quite concerned about something like crime and immigration, which I think feeds into them being the least favorable toward Mexico of the more Democratic voting groups. And then you have 1 in 6 who we think of as being on the furthest to the left. Now, when we ask voters, how important do you think the U.S. Mexico relationship is? More good news is that 6 in 10 believe that this is an important relationship. In fact, a very important relationship. Very few think that this is just not something we should be that concerned about. And in fact, 1 in 4 think that it is extremely important that we have a friendly relationship with Mexico. When we ask whether you think Mexico is a good or bad neighbor to the United States, this to me is the most encouraging slide for our friends in Mexico. Because on this question, even though we see that Republicans overall still have this leaning, somewhat unfavorable view of Mexico itself, they believe that Mexico is a better neighbor than they did 6 months ago. And I have some theories on why that is. I'm excited to discuss with you after I present this data. But very good news here in that back in March, Republicans very much felt that Mexico is not a good neighbor, and they have come around to a very split view on that question. When we ask voters, why do you think Mexico is a good neighbor, if at all? We've seen remarkable consistency month to month. So the green bars are what people said in March. The yellow bars are what they said in June, and the blue bars are what they said in September. And you'll see very little change across that 6-month time horizon. The biggest thing that people think makes Mexico a good neighbor to the U.S. is that we have a lot of tourism between our countries. We have an economic relationship that benefits the United States, and we have cultural exchange between U.S. and Mexican people. That they view that friendship as very rooted in that economic and tourism and cultural exchange piece. They are somewhat less aware of things like cooperation on migration at the southern border or cooperation on national security. And when we ask people in what ways is Mexico perhaps a bad neighbor to the United States, we also find some fair degree of consistency across the months over these key questions. Cartel activity coming across the border, the spread of fentanyl in the U.S., as well as enabling unauthorized migration across our southern border. Although I would note there is a statistically significant drop in the fentanyl fentanyl and unauthorized migration numbers relative to where they were in March. And I suspect that is playing something of a role in those Republican numbers getting more favorable over the last 6 months. When we ask, is Mexico generally helping or hurting the United States when it comes to a variety of different items? Here you can see promoting a strong economy on our continent. People are becoming more positive about that. There's significant uncertainty about the role that Mexico plays when it comes to countering the influence of China on our continent. Most voters are sort of very unaware of this narrative at all, much less aware of the extent to which Mexico is helping us. But we see on other items, things like combating violent gangs and cartel activity and stopping the flow of fentanyl to communities, we see that there is a big decline in the percentage of Americans who think Mexico is hurting us in that way, to now where we've gotten back to neutral. So there really has been some progress in that U.S. Mexico relationship on these items in the minds of many voters over the last 6 months. But let's turn now to trade and tariffs, which is a very important topic that is extremely timely and of great interest to many in this room. When we ask in our survey, do you approve or disapprove of the way Donald Trump is handling a variety of issues? Voters tend to be more favorable toward his policies on immigration and foreign policy, but have become much more skeptical of how he is approaching things like the economy and trade. And this is a real departure from Donald Trump's first term as president. When Donald Trump was president the first time around, you had a number of voters that said, you know what, I'm not sure that I love him. I don't love his style, but I think he's doing a great job on the economy. And this time around, you don't see that dynamic quite as much. His scores on things like the economy, and especially on tariffs, tend to be lower than his overall job approval. He still gets somewhat high marks for an issue like immigration relative to other issues, but you've also seen some level of concern rise about it. To what extent is his administration sort of enforcing things in a way that some voters don't find to be in keeping with how America should enforce its interior border policy? But we can also see that over time there has become some slight increases in opposition to Trump's handling of tariffs, notably among independents. Back in February, when we first started asking this question, there was a real sense among voters that, look, I don't love this, but let's wait and see. Let's see what his actual plan is. Let's see what the supposed Liberation Day looks like. Let's see what his negotiations turn into and how this shakes out in practice. And what we've seen is that Democrats started off not liking tariffs, and they don't like them now. Republicans started off positively, and the overall support remains high, but there is this increased disapproval among Republicans, as some who initially were unsure or on the fence will wind up leaning against. But those independent numbers are very striking, and we now have a very strong net negative among independents for Trump's trade policies. What I am looking at as an analyst is to what extent things like Christmas shopping as we approach the holiday season, is that when voters really begin to notice more of a direct consequence of tariffs and become even more negative? Or do we get to a place where they say, okay, this is now just sort of part of how I'm experiencing the economy, and it just means that the overall economy numbers will get worse? Again, when we look at those 8 political tribes, it's fascinating to see how they differ on the issue of trade and tariffs. For that hard right group, they love what Donald Trump is doing on tariffs, and they don't think that free trade helps the United States. We asked a question, do you on balance think that free trade helps or hurts us? The hard right thinks that free trade hurts us, as do these new Republican populists, those sort of ex-Democratic voters who are populist, union workers, blue collar, and came to the party from Trump. But there are 2 other tribes within the Republican Party that are somewhat skeptical of Donald Trump on tariffs, and they do generally believe that free trade helps. So the Republican Party is not unified on this question, in the way that the Democratic Party seems to be much more unified. They overwhelmingly dislike what Donald Trump is doing on tariffs, and they overwhelmingly think free trade tends to help. The one group that doesn't are these young and disillusioned, the sort of anti-establishment young people who generally are just skeptical of capitalism and markets in general. And so for them, the idea of free trade with other countries raises a number of concerns for them. When we take a look at how things have changed, there has been somewhat relatively little change overall in terms of support for tariffs on goods coming to the U.S. from Mexico. Voters were 4 points against it before. They're 4 points against it now. But notably, Republicans have become somewhat more supportive of a tariff on goods coming from Mexico, while other voter groups have become less favorable. But when we ask this question, we say, complete this sentence. When America trades goods and services with Mexico, does it make your cost of living much cheaper or does it make it more expensive? Voters generally think that trade with Mexico improves their cost of living. And considering how in every survey I'm looking at these days, cost of living remains a number one issue for American voters, I think it would be very unwise for politicians to ignore the fact that voters think trade with Mexico does help cost of living. And then notably, when we say if the United States places tariffs on goods that come into the U.S. from Mexico, a whopping 6 in 10 say that this will make things more expensive for them. So some real potential red flags for American policymakers advancing tough tariff policy that voters are picking up that this could have an effect on their bottom line. And we've seen as well that when you look to what extent, if the United States places tariffs on goods that come into the U.S. from Mexico, will it make my cost of living more expensive? Overwhelmingly, they are saying more expensive. But one caution, as voters believe tariffs have been in place since that prominent announcement on Liberation Day, as I mentioned, they've started to just see them as this is a thing that is now baked into my experience. And so as it has already made their cost of living more expensive, that forward-looking assessment is becoming less acute. It's not going to make them more expensive down the road because it's already making them more expensive. So with that, I'd love to take the rest of the time to take some questions from you, Pedro. And thank you again for including me in your gathering here. It's such an honor to be here.
I mean, this is probably the third or fourth time I look into this data that came out just last week. And it keeps blowing my mind. There's a lot of things I want to discuss with you. I hope that you all enjoyed the presentation and that are also kind of grasping everything that came out of it. So, Kristen, my first question is, who or what is shaping the views on Mexico from the American voter? From the American Chamber of Commerce, we've discussed on and on about engaging in some sort of campaigning, talking to our employees, being more active in Washington. And so what is it that is driving these changes in perceptions? Is it Donald Trump? Is it the media? Is it the public riots? What is it?
So my suspicion is that you can split this into two camps. There are those items that were the reasons why Americans think Mexico is a good neighbor. Cultural exchange, economic exchange, tourism. And those are being driven by personal experiences. Those are being driven by trips people have taken, friends they've made, other pieces of culture that they are personally experiencing that have made those sort of longer lasting positive views of, yes, it is good that we are friends. It is good that we share a border. We are richer and we benefit as a country from that relationship. My suspicion is that the negative things stem less from personal experience and more from media coverage. And to the extent that Mexico is caught up in unfavorable narratives around really hot button issues in media. So things like fentanyl, things like migration, things like cartels, etc. I suspect that this is also being driven by, fragmented news consumption. So if you are somebody who's watching MSNBC day to day, as we see in those clusters, that further left cluster, they're not going to be seeing negative headlines about Mexico at all. Where if you are watching more conservative media, you may be seeing more negative headlines about what is going on at the border, how is this sustainable, worries about crime in communities, etc. And I do think that it is notable that some of these shifts you've seen among Republicans over the last number of months are in part because now in conservative media, the story of the border is in chaos is no longer an appealing story. It's also, you've had big changes in government policy that have really shifted what is occurring in terms of enforcement at the border, et cetera. But I think the idea of a border in crisis for many conservatives, that's not how they feel anymore. And so they've now sort of shifted more toward topics of like interior enforcement, but that is creating space for a more positive narrative about Mexico to be in place. So I think The good news about Mexico tends to be from positive experiences that are personal, and those are harder to dislodge, where the negative narratives are more media-driven, and those come and go by the news cycle. As we saw in that data where you had that one negative spike in June that very quickly went away around the immigration protests in LA.
I think it was yesterday in the conversation with Gallup, if I'm not mistaken, that we spoke about how different topics just change in terms of who's in power. Let's say Democrats one day will be in favor of X or Y thing, and right after they lose the White House, they change their perception altogether about that topic in particular. Is it Mexico one of those things that as we approach the electoral process in the midterms, and then once we have the presidential campaign in a few years, do you think this is something that it's going to change? Or, for example, the things about migration and fentanyl, are we in a place where there's more bipartisan support on that and will stay that way in the long term? A little bit about kind of long-term trends on this.
Sure. And it's a great question. You're right that there are so many things I see in data that are very dependent on who is in power. I mean, questions as far as, is the country on the right track or the wrong track? Right. The day after the election, essentially, you see people switch their attitudes based on who has just been elected or who is leaving power. You see this very powerfully in economic data. People's assessment of, is your personal economic situation getting better or worse? The minute an election happens or the minute somebody new is inaugurated, magically, people who felt very downbeat about the economy start to feel a little better and vice versa. And so some of this is driven by who is in charge. And foreign policy and international relations is an area where we see voters follow the leader quite a bit. You can take a look at polling around something like Russia, for instance, a very different topic. But if you look over a long enough time period, back during the sort of 2010s, early 2010s, you saw that it was Republicans who were much more unfavorable toward Russia than were Democrats. And then you get to the 2016 election and all of the drama around Russia there, and the numbers just immediately flip. It's not that Republicans start liking Russia, but immediately the partisan signal has been sent, like they're not the big problem. Or for Democrats, Russia is our number one adversary. And so that's just one example of foreign policy. Attitudes are very malleable and heavily driven by messaging coming from leaders of both parties. I think it's notable that when running for office, there's a need to say, okay, we have these external enemies and we need to fight back against them. And you need to put me in power so that I can really sort of put the screws to them. And you have not seen that kind of negative rhetoric about Mexico, I don't think, from Donald Trump as president in the way that you might have seen him sort of casting about for adversaries or, oh, the Biden administration was too weak on X, Y, and Z during a campaign cycle. And so being in power, I think, makes it more advantageous for the president to talk about wins he's achieved, deals he's made, progress that is being made in terms of things like crime, migration, fentanyl, as a result of cultivating friendships or cutting deals with our friends and allies. So I do think that longer term, there is an extent to which Americans' perceptions of not just Mexico, but the U.S. Mexico relationship are going to be fairly heavily dependent on what messaging is coming from leaders.
And one of the things that I loved about this new data was this tribe analysis. I mean, it's super interesting just to know about them, and then knowing about what they think is even better. Is there anything there that you would like to highlight to the audience? I mean, I was trying to connect the dots and saying, well, probably this kind of a group that might be growing over time and appealing to them and talking to them about the positive things about Mexico might be a good strategy, because this is a group that Donald Trump is kind of putting its eye on. I don't know. Talk us through a little bit more of those tribes, and if there's something hitting there positive or negative about Mexico that we should be aware of.
So when I look at those tribes, I think if I'm looking to improve the narrative about Mexico on the Republican side, the two tribes I would look at the most are those moderate Republicans who are quite positive about free trade. And, I think in some ways are not necessarily aligned with maybe the rhetorical approach that President Trump always takes, or some of his more kind of anti-establishment views. But clearly we saw in the data that right now they are not feeling very warmly toward Mexico. And I think that is because for those moderate Republicans, and I would put the middle American optimists in sort of the same category, for them, just anxieties about personal safety, migration, crime, fentanyl, et cetera, are what is overriding the many other things that could very easily lead them to have warm feelings toward Mexico. They're not looking to throw up a bunch of tariffs. They're not looking to, shut down the economic relationship. And so I think that is a group that, as the temperature gets turned down on what's happening at the border, and as President Trump becomes more and more eager to claim victories for reduced flows of fentanyl or anything like that, that's going to take off the pressure. And those are the two groups that I think you would see move the most to becoming a more pro-Mexico sort of audience. On the Democratic side, the group that I think falls into that camp is the electability Democrats. So this is not to go too deep on sort of American domestic politics, but on the Democratic side, the Democratic Party is somewhat divided right now between their very online progressive activist base that wants to really drive the party in a very kind of aggressive direction, and the reality that actually many of their primary voters are more moderate than you might suspect. And so that electability Democrats group is who I think of in that camp, right? They're perfectly fine with taxes on the wealthy. They want to see a robust government safety net. They're not in danger of voting for Republicans really anytime soon, but they also think that their party has maybe gone a little bit too far on a number of items. And so they want to see, what can Democrats do to say, we're trying to get drugs off the street, we're trying to keep your family safe. And so I feel like that is an interesting group that could be, I can see them sort of putting pressure on their own party. Hey, you need to do something about these issues. We're not anti-Mexico. So can you find ways to actually have a positive narrative on these issues and play a constructive role? I would keep an eye on them as a potential sort of group, a critical voter group that could be part of a very positive conversation.
For the past couple of years, every time I visit Washington, and this is obviously not a robust analysis on how American voters think, but at least some politicians, if I can see some sort of bipartisan support of something, is everyone is against China. And I know you briefly mentioned the perception on how Mexico is supporting or going against China, something like that. And it's more or less kind of split, but people don't know much about that. I'm curious about, what are you seeing, aside from this polling, on the perception that U.S. voters have on China, and if that is a topic in which Mexico could potentially play some sort of a role that yields out positively to us, in the sense of your friend's enemy is your enemy as well, or something like that's the saying, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
So right now, the issue of China is one where in Washington, there is a significant amount of bipartisan consensus that a rising China is a challenge, and being prepared to compete with China, both economically and in terms of security, is very important. And for your average American voter, that is just not a conversation they're having. That is not a topic of conversation around the water cooler. It's not something that's keeping American voters up at night. Occasionally, you'll have these sort of strange news stories that will pop. Like, remember when that balloon was floating across the United States? And all of a sudden people go like, well, that doesn't sound great. But in general, this is not something that feels acute and immediate. Right now, there's a question that I asked in my survey last month, which was, which of the following do you agree with more? The greatest threats to the United States come from outside, in terms of countries like Russia, Iran, and China, or the greatest threats to the United States come from within, in terms of polarization, political corruption, and dysfunctional cultural trends? Is the biggest enemy inside or outside? And by a 20 to 73 margin, people said the biggest problem is inside the house. So only 1 in 5 Americans views external threats as the thing they're the most worried about. They really think we've got to get our own house in order before we have the luxury of worrying about what happens if Russia invades Taiwan. Like, that is so far removed from the average American's like top issue concern set. Notably, it is Republicans, even though Republicans as of late have been the more sort of isolationist in some ways, they are the most likely to say the biggest threats come from outside the country. But even then, it's only 1/3 of Republicans thinking that the biggest threat is overseas. The domestic concerns are just so acute that something like China in the short run is further down on the spectrum. At the same time, I think longer term, these issues aren't going away. And when you hear about things that China is trying to do to absolutely dominate in AI, in electric vehicles, in the biopharmaceutical industry, in a whole range of important industries where America would like to think it dominates or really wants to dominate, but is absolutely at risk of losing its leadership role or never having a leadership role to begin with, I think that is going to begin raising concerns, like more of a slow boil. That is, of course, barring some, horrible national security incident changing things overnight. But just at the moment, this China question, and you saw it on that, to what extent is that a way in which Mexico is a good neighbor to us, countering the rise of Chinese influence? A lot of voters see that question and they kind of scratch their head, like, what does that mean? Which doesn't mean there's not a story to be told, but it's a much sort of longer term question as the threat of China is much further down the list of people's concerns. Take, for instance, one last thing on this, the TikTok ban. So a bipartisan group of legislators passed legislation banning TikTok in the United States. And President Trump, for whatever reason, you can psychoanalyze him and his thoughts on TikTok all you want, has opted against enforcing the law. And that's going to play its way through the courts, et cetera. But this is something where in Washington, you can't get bipartisan agreement on a whole lot of anything. And there was a sense that this is a real threat. This is the data collection, the psychological effects. Like, this is a real problem. And yet voters themselves don't seem to be up in arms about the lack of enforcement about this ban. And so it's just one more example to show that the China issue is one where you saw the favorable, unfavorable data. Voters don't like China, but it is just very far down on the list of things that are currently alarming them about the world.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess those are one of the echo chambers, at least on our end, we put ourselves into, and it's interesting to see your thoughts on that. In that same space, there's a constant question in my head, and let's see if I can explain this the right way. I think there are kind of conflicting narratives coexisting in the Americans' minds. For instance, based on the data, U.S. voters see the positive side of the economic integration with Mexico, how trading with Mexico makes their lives probably easier or cheaper, or both. But at the same time, they do see on an important basis how Mexico is a bad neighbor on a whole bunch of issues like fentanyl, migration, and border security, and so on. And obviously, take the subjectivity of where it comes from. I represent close to 1,500 companies, American companies in Mexico, and every time we speak about this and the narrative that we must build in order to build those bridges in the U.S., everyone is just constantly scratching their head and saying, why aren't they looking at these amazing trade data on how our relationship is super good and how Mexico is positive for the U.S. and so on and so forth. But in this echo chamber where we live in, it's hard for us to grasp, at least for people in Mexico City, how strong of an issue fentanyl really is. And I know that there's a lot of people here that live in the border, but also for a Mexico City guy, the border is very far away. And I definitely do not understand the border dynamics, even though I read about them and so on and so forth. So what I'm trying to say here, and the question is, how should we live and work with those opposing narratives, both of them being true, And what role should the private sector or this audience in general, based on people from the private sector, academia, government officials, should we work on plugging those things together, coexisting with them, and making them work, understanding that our bilateral relationship is for both of our countries the most important relationship? If that makes sense.
I think it does. So I think I think there are interesting ways to link the positives of the economic narrative to a shared desire to address the negative pieces of the narrative.
Right.
I think it would genuinely surprise the average American voter to know just how integrated our economies are, or the extent to which something that is made in America may require parts that are made in Mexico or vice versa. That this idea of made in America, of something starting entirely from materials that are sourced from within the United States and manufactured into parts that are then assembled, that I think many voters don't realize the extent to which having those trading partners north and south of us with whom we share a border to, I think that is not a narrative that they know much about, and the extent to which what is good for Mexico economically is good for the U.S. I think they're open to the idea of that. You see it in the is Mexico a good neighbor number. But the reason I think you then can link that to the bad things is, and to a shared desire to fix the bad things, is it is easier for us to trade across the border when the border is safe, when we are confident that something going from one side to the other is going to contain what we think it does and not contain things we don't think it should. And that because of that shared desire to tackle challenges like migration, crime, cartels, et cetera, I think there are ways to frame it as a win-win. That by tackling the stuff that right now has not been working as well, but we're making progress. And you can even see in the data that I presented, over the last 6 months, people feel there's been progress. We're working toward that goal because we know that those things are necessary in order to have the kind of economic relationship we want. And then I think telling a little bit more about the story that Mexico is helping Made in America become a reality in a way that for many voters, they are sort of craving that economic rebirth at home. I think there is real potential opportunity there. I also, just from a tactical perspective, cannot say enough about how important something like social media and storytelling is to any kind of narrative that you are looking to drive. A very sort of tragic example of the power of social media and storytelling and shaping public opinion that I see every day is the way in which public opinion has dramatically been reshaped around what's going on in Gaza and Israel, driven very heavily by content that people are receiving on social media. There was some great coverage of this in the Wall Street Journal this past week, as well as the New York Times. All of which is to say, things that feel very distant from an American's everyday experience of the world, they are picking up on through traditional media for sure. Again, that's how you have conservatives and Republicans watch Fox News and their sense of alarm grows about things like what's happening at the border. But social media is a way, especially for a younger generation, that maybe they don't have any recollection of fights over things like NAFTA, et cetera. For them, explaining what the U.S. Mexico economic relationship looks like, I really feel like social media is a place where you have to have your story being told, or else it's not going to be told at all.
Super insightful. And I think when you were talking about the economic positiveness of Mexico, gives me way to speaking about tariffs. I think tariffs are one of those issues where we do see an interesting and important divide within the Republican Party, needless to say about the homogeneity of the Democrats' view on them. But also yesterday we were mentioning about this famous quote of, "It's the economy, stupid," right? How are tariffs going to play out in the future based on what the Americans are looking on tariffs? We had an interesting conversation with Senator Ted Cruz just a few weeks ago that he was here in Mexico City. And he was telling us about a two-camp divide within Donald Trump's closer inner group, saying that there's one camp that sees tariffs as the end goal, something that has to be permanently there in order to rebalance the trade relationship. But there's camp number two, where people are saying this is a means to an end. We need to use them as negotiating tools to achieve X and Y objective. And so, anyway, in that front, who do you think's gonna win, and what the future of tariffs are gonna be? I know it's a tough question for you, but
no, but it's a good question, and it's actually one that we asked about in our March survey. And so, in our March survey, around the time that tariffs were first really being introduced, and Liberation Day was right on the horizon, we asked voters, which of the following do you agree with more? Donald Trump is pursuing these tariffs because he believes that tariffs are kind of good in and of themselves, or Donald Trump is pursuing these tariffs as a way to put pressure on other countries to negotiate for other things that are in America's interest. And even Republicans really believed this is more the latter of what you talked about, that he's using tariffs to just sort of expand the number of tools in his toolkit that he has when he's negotiating with other countries. But I think the longer that tariffs stay in place, the less and less it becomes clear that that's the goal. And the more and more it seems as though the tariffs in and of themselves are a thing that he just really likes. Right. And I think the fact that they were sort of implemented, and yes, they implemented, then pulled back, and it's still very chaotic, and you never know what will get a new tariff slapped on it week to week. But he likes talking about, oh, it's raised X amount of revenue for the government. He loves that narrative. And he also really loves the narrative that, you see things like, for instance, there was an article, I believe in the New York Times either yesterday or the day before, that Sharpie, the company that manufactures permanent markers, that they're now moving a ton of manufacturing to make Sharpies in America. And it's that kind of story that I think is going to keep Trump going, see, I'm on the right track, I'm on the right track. For the moment, voters are not yet punishing Trump and his party significantly for the tariffs, because they're saying, I don't really like them, but it's still a question of whether I'm feeling them or not. I feel like life is too expensive. I feel like cost of living is too high, but it's not 100% clear that they are saying it is too high because of the tariffs. The longer this goes on and the more that voters go, okay, well, what are you going to do about cost of living if the White House's main economic policy that they've advanced is tariffs? I think that has the potential to create some political challenges for them. So again, this is why I think the holiday shopping season is going to be so critical, because you recall earlier in this conversation, Donald Trump gave a quote somewhere where he said something like, maybe you don't need to buy that many dolls for Christmas. Maybe you just buy one doll. I can guarantee you that Democrats are waiting with that clip just teed up to begin blanketing the airwaves with it as people begin their Christmas shopping, if they're still feeling the cost of living is too high. And if they can point to tariff policy as this is not just a hangover from Biden, but this is a thing Donald Trump did to make your life more expensive, I think there's real political peril in that.
Oh, yes. Our friends from Mattel were not very happy when that came out. They were extremely worried about the Barbie sales. Surprisingly enough, we're approaching the end. And this might be the last question of this panel. Because we could not go without discussing the USMCA and understanding that we're right into the review process, potentially a renegotiation. We know that NAFTA was not a popular topic in the U.S., but probably USMCA, with some minor tweaks here and there, became something, well, at least with bipartisan support. What are your thoughts on the future of the USMCA?
So my thought on the future of the USMCA is that this is, I think Donald Trump, it would be wise for him to remember the things he did in his first term that voters really liked. And remember, in his first term, the economy was something that voters were very enthusiastic about. And it really wasn't until, COVID massively disrupted the economy that had been building that sort of threw that into real question. And USMCA was a piece of economic policy that his team was really thinking through in that first term. Right. So my hope is that he will take a win and allow that win to become a win again. and to recognize that this is a way for him to say, look, I put this trade deal in place before, it did well, maybe there are some tweaks and changes to make things better because the world has changed in the last however many years. But my hope is that leaning into the fact that this is not like it was a policy that was crafted by some other president that's been handed to him, but to the extent it can be like, this is a great thing you did before, don't you want to do it again, I think can't be underestimated as a strong message.
That's a great way to end up just in time. Kristen, I'm extremely thankful about the work that you're doing. I think it's substantially useful for the bilateral relationship. So thank you for that. And most of all, thank you for coming to Mexico City, talking to everyone here around. And thank you for your time. Thank you all for listening. Please, a round of applause.